It's the fundamental tenet, the guiding principle, derived from the ancient Greeks, an ethical dictum that helped define Western medicine. First, do no harm. No doubt, pre-med student Michael Andrade knew that axiom and lived by it. Michael never harmed anyone. He only wanted to help people. But one morning in February of 2005, not long after Valentine's Day, someone most decidedly wanted to harm Michael Andrade, setting his San Antonio, Texas apartment ablaze in what appeared to be a deadly case of arson, only for the culprit to mysteriously disappear in a cloud of smoke. Investigators couldn't figure it out. Who would want to harm a young, aspiring doctor who only wanted to help people? Good question. But with their suspect in the wind and nearly all of their evidence a pile of ashes, detectives would turn to a team of forensic experts who would dedicate themselves to finding this elusive killer with every fiber of their being. And that's because this is Dead Sleep's tribute to Forensic Files, the February Forensic Files flashback. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of Dead Sleep, and as you likely know by now, a longtime enthusiast of Forensic Files as the ultimate true crime sleep aid. And for the month of February, I am going back and revisiting 3 episodes of Forensic Files and doing my best to transform them, expand them, expound upon them, to optimize them for nighttime listening. Though, honestly, it doesn't matter whether you know Forensic Files or ever fell asleep to it, but if you have, tonight's episode is from Season 12, Episode 2, titled Insulated Evidence. Though, as always, this is my own twist on events, with plenty of dense details and sleepy sidebars to help guide us as we fatigue our overactive minds to get a good night's sleep. Oh, and a quick thank you to everyone who supports this podcast. Dead Sleep is 100% independent, 100% listener supported, and 100% ad-free. As you know, I have a whole other journalist life, but believe it or not, I am just a few hundred subscribers away from making this a real business. A moonlighting passion project just may become a real job, which is thrilling. Thank you so much. If you would like to be part of this niche community of true crime insomniacs, please consider a paid subscription. There are usually 2 free episodes a month and then a longer bonus episode each month. If you would like that bonus content, you can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Patreon, and Spotify. Now, let's get back to the good stuff, the episode. And in this episode, our story begins in February of 2005 in an apartment located just off of a university campus in San Antonio, Texas. A maze-like series of 2-story structures, each structure containing several 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. What these apartments lacked in grandeur they made up for in amenities. This apartment complex boasted the perfect mix of sophisticated city living with safe and secure suburban life. Each unit offered a spacious floor plan with an eat-in kitchen, separate living room area, in-unit washer-dryer, and of course, the holy grail of every apartment seeker: large walk-in closets. Another huge plus was the massive swimming pool and the attractive landscaping, dutifully maintained by gardeners who regularly buzz through the complex in the mornings, briskly trimming any overgrown hedges and ruthlessly yanking out the first sign of unwanted weeds. And that morning, in late February of 2005, it was one of those gardeners who first noticed the acrid smell of smoke perforating the lush aroma of freshly cut grass. Where was this smoke coming from? The groundskeeper looked around the complex, but couldn't see any flames. He and his colleagues stood scanning the windows of the buildings for several minutes, until they noticed there was one unit with its closed windows nearly opaque, the glass of the windows covered in what looked like gray ash. The men dashed to the unit on the second floor and easily opened the door. It was unlocked. But from there, any hope of getting inside was near impossible. The smoke inside that unit, it was so noxious and so powerful, it drove the men away, and they quickly called 911, desperate to help whoever it was inside. From the outside, it likely looked like chaos: fire trucks and firefighters, EMTs, ambulances. But firefighters and first responders, they are trained tacticians. And the first thing a firefighter does on the scene is something called reading the smoke. They could tell by the shape of the smoke that this was a strange blaze. Not one big burn, but 3 separate little fires throughout the one-bedroom apartment. It was as if someone had gone room to room, hastily setting things aflame, including an antique chair which triggered a fire in between the kitchen and the living room. They soon saw the other 2 fires were set in the bedroom, one near the foot of the bed and the other in one of those spacious walk-in bedroom closets. And it was in that bedroom where they found the apartment's sole occupant, Michael Andrade, on the bed, face down, not moving, not breathing. And perhaps that was the strangest part of all. As the foot of his bed burned, singeing the bed sheets, Michael was himself, virtually untouched by the flames. Much like the inside of the closed windows, Michael's body was coated with a gray soot, a fine layer of particle debris from the fire resting the full length of the back of his body. What really happened here? The person who started this fire, they hadn't used an accelerant, no ignitable fluids such as kerosene or turpentine. Without accelerant, these fires were smoky, but they were small and slow-moving, suggesting there should have been, ample time for someone like Michael, young and able-bodied, to get dressed and flee the apartment, save his own life. And yet there he was, in boxers and a t-shirt, face down in bed, as if unaware, unconscious. It didn't take long to determine whatever happened to Michael Andrade, it had happened before the fires. Sadly, any efforts to revive Michael, they failed. And when the smoke actually cleared, authorities had to tell Michael's mother and his sister Stephanie the terrible news. The young man whose life and career were just getting started. It had all suddenly, shockingly, come to a tragic end. His family would be stunned to also learn that his cause of death wasn't smoke inhalation or anything related to the fire, but from asphyxiation of a different kind. Going by the marks found around his neck and a piece of torn bedsheet found nearby, someone had strangled Michael to death first, then in some kind of frenzy, set not one, not two, but 3 little fires. His family couldn't believe it. His mother had told Michael so many times that one day all of his hard work would pay off. And he had worked very hard. He was to be the first doctor in the family. And now, his life ended like this. So senselessly and mysteriously. Neither his mother nor his sister had a single clue as to who might have done this, or why. But even Sister Stephanie understood that you didn't need to be a forensic expert to know that those 3 fires were set to cover up the killer's tracks. And so far, it appeared to be working. Whoever did this had somehow escaped out of that apartment, unseen, undetected. But how? It was on the 2nd floor. There were 2 possible ways this could have happened. One very simple, the other elaborate. The person could have walked out the front door. Just a matter of seconds, as the fire started before the gardening crew noticed the smoke. The second possibility was they escaped from the balcony. As the gardening crew made their way up the stairs to the 2nd floor apartment, this killer could have escaped through the glass doors onto the balcony, climbed over and down the side using a wood lattice trellis affixed to the balcony, making their way to the balcony on the 1st floor just below. Then, once they reached the edge of that balcony, they were just a few feet from the ground. Next to that balcony on the 1st floor was some very nicely pruned bushes, just thick enough for a person to hide behind until the coast was clear. Police made quick work scouring the apartment complex looking for possible suspects. But this apartment complex was like a maze with multiple structures of similar design. That person could be anywhere, and they had no idea who they were looking for. But they did know that the person who did this was no professional arsonist or even a criminal mastermind. This murder had not been planned out. The weapon that was used to strangle Michael was torn from his own bedsheet. And those fires, the lack of accelerant, and the placement of those fires, it seemed emotional. There had to be some type of connection between those 3 places where the fires were set. Some old antique chair. Was that of sentimental value? The foot of Michael's bed. And then his closet full of clothes. As if it weren't enough to kill Michael, this person wanted to destroy his entire existence. They tried to scorch him off the face of the earth. Whoever did this was angry at Michael with a rage of someone who might have wanted revenge. Police believed whoever did this had to be close to Michael. Maybe even intimate. Now, when the Gardners came to the apartment, the front door was unlocked, but police believed that whoever did this, it was Michael who'd let them in. And they believed, based on what he was wearing when he was found, that was a possible clue in insight into his relationship with that person. Michael was found in his boxer shorts and a t-shirt, basically his pajamas. So whoever it was that police believed came to that door, he knew them well enough to walk to the door as is. No need to put on pants. And he continued to stay in his t-shirt and boxers throughout that person's entire visit. So what did that mean? Who would be maybe the one person that would come over and you would have an entire conversation, maybe even an argument in basically your pajamas/underpants? Timing-wise, it was just a few days after Valentine's Day, February 17th. So, going by that logic, the person they were looking for was likely someone who loved Michael the most, and someone who also hated Michael the most. The answer was some pretty simple math. 1. Just 1. Michael was a chemistry major. It may sound strange to say, but chemistry and true crime, they share something in common. A fundamental interest in finding out the why of a reaction. In understanding things don't just happen. There has to be a reason. In chemistry, most chemical reactions, well, they come from bonds. A bond that was either formed or a bond that was broken. In this murder investigation, it followed along those same lines. Police were interested in finding out what kind of bonds Michael had in his life, how strong they were, and what bonds, if any, were broken. The most important bond in Michael's life in 2005 was with his girlfriend, we'll call Lily. Lily and Michael were young, but they appeared to share a strong bond, one that was a good balance. Bespectacled and buttoned up, Michael was described as sweet and shy, while his girlfriend, she appeared more open and extroverted. The two were both ambitious and smart, and they seemed to know what they wanted from life, their future mapped out, still in their early 20s. And there's even a photo of Michael and Lily where she's holding up her hand with what looks like a sliver of a ring on her finger. A suggestion. that they were in a committed relationship with plans to be together forever. But behind that strong bond lurked a darker reality, an emotional volatility in the relationship that deeply affected Michael. And after his death, Michael's sister, Stephanie, revealed how the couple often argued, and how her brother, who was sensitive and quiet, would get so overwhelmed by these ups and downs in his relationship with Lily. More than once, he'd been brought to tears, unsure of what to do. And it seemed that morning, that bond between Michael and Lily had been irrevocably broken. When police checked Michael's phone, one of the last, if not the last voicemail he received was from his girlfriend, or rather, his soon-to-be ex-girlfriend. She'd left him an angry message just 3 days after Valentine's Day, letting him know this relationship was over. And with this evidence of Lily's rage, a plausible scenario began to form. Michael's girlfriend had left that message around 8:30 that morning, and as time passed, perhaps she grew even more angry that he hadn't called her back. And so she decided to go to his apartment that morning and confront him, to tell him in person that this was it. That would explain why he was still in his boxers. When Lily came to his apartment door, she made herself known. If Michael was asleep, he was likely unaware that she'd even left him that threatening voicemail until he opened the door. Maybe they went to the bedroom to talk it out. Things got heated and she lost control, setting his apartment on fire like she was Lisa Left Eye Lopez. But there was one thing wrong with this scenario. It only told half the story. Michael was murdered before those 3 small fires were set. And his cause of death was from someone coming up behind him and strangling him with a torn bedsheet, a makeshift weapon. Detectives would have to ask themselves, did she have it in her? Or did she have help? Perhaps a friend or a relative who agreed to help take care of this man she wanted out of her life for good. Sure, Lily looked sweet and innocent. Homicide detectives would be the first ones to say, when it comes to love gone wrong, anything is possible. When they interviewed Lily, she swore she was innocent. She told detectives to search her house, which they did, and she also told them she had an alibi. She was a student, but she also worked part-time in the mornings. And when she'd called and left that angry message for Michael, she was at work. Investigators looked into it, and much to their surprise, well, she was where she said she was. She was indeed at work when she called and left that voicemail, and she was at work for the rest of the morning. So unless she'd snuck out and somehow pulled this off without anyone seeing her, they scratched her off a very short, one-person suspect list. What now? They continued to excavate what was left of Michael's apartment. One investigator noticed something peculiar. There was soot from the fire all over the apartment. that fine gray dust that had settled on everything, including Michael himself. But there was one small area in the bedroom that was strangely clean, soot-free. The spotless area was on Michael's desk. Basically, a rectangle that didn't have any dust on it at all. Something had been in that spot. And by the size and shape of that rectangle, it appeared there used to be a laptop resting on that desk, and someone had taken it. But if someone had stolen that laptop before setting the fire, that gray soot would have covered the entire desk. So this was strange, because it suggested that whoever did this may have entered the house twice. The first time they entered the house, they'd killed Michael and started the fire. And then they came back a second time, fighting the flames to go in and steal Michael's laptop. They also noticed a few other items were missing. From stereo equipment to the keys to Michael's F-150 pickup truck. Things just didn't add up. If the person escaped through the front door or the balcony, the only two ways out of Michael's apartment, how did they escape with a pair of bulky stereo speakers and a laptop? And somehow, if they'd managed to make it outside and they had the keys to his truck, they had the means for a perfect getaway. But the truck was still there. So now the scope of their investigation, it was much, much closer to home. Whoever did this, they might live in the apartment complex. But this apartment complex, it was like a maze. Nearly identical looking units, a sprawl of structures, all kinds of people moving in and moving out. It was so easy to get lost if you didn't know where you were going and didn't have a single clue who you were looking for. Such were the circumstances for the police in this investigation. So they started in a logical place, the apartment next door, where they met a single mother named Maria. And unfortunately, she wasn't much of a witness. She was at work, her child was at school. All Maria could really offer was relief and gratitude that she wasn't there that day. The two units shared a wall. It would be terrifying to think what could have happened had that fire spread. Detectives then asked Michael's family if he'd ever mentioned anything or anyone suspicious. And Stephanie, that's Michael's sister, she said, actually, he had. She hadn't thought much about it at the time. He was just some weird guy who Michael said liked to hang around the complex. And Michael would often come out and see this guy around his building, near his property. And this guy, he always seemed eager for conversation, maybe a little too eager. His presence made Michael uncomfortable. But it seems Michael didn't report the man. He just let it go. He hadn't done anything wrong or illegal, at least not that Stephanie knew about. Besides, maybe Michael just chalked it up as his own issue. Michael wasn't the most outgoing kind of guy. And maybe he worried he was just being overly sensitive, paranoid. But of course, now in hindsight, these seemingly offhand conversations gained great importance. Did she happen to know if Michael mentioned a man's name or any physical description? No, Stephanie said, with great remorse. He was just some guy. Some weird guy. And with that, another dead end. And a realization that they maybe had this case wrong from the very beginning, thinking it was someone Michael knew. Maybe it was a stranger who'd killed Michael, then lit the apartment on fire. But why kill Michael? And why these 3 locations of that fire? For a robbery, it just seemed like overkill. Were this some kind of robbery gone wrong? They revisited the 3 locations where those little fires had been set. There was that vintage chair, then the fire at the foot of Michael's bed, then the clothes in his closet. Now looking at it through the lens of a perfect stranger, maybe this person saw this vintage chair, saw that it was old, that it was made of fabric, and likely believed that if they lit it up, it would keep burning. And a fire in that part of Michael's apartment, it would burn traces of evidence. It would also keep people out of the apartment. The smoke in the flames possibly giving this intruder some time to escape. Presumably off of that balcony, because it wouldn't have been possible through the front door. The second location was the foot of Michael's bed. It made sense if that's where the murder happened. But then there was that third fire. Michael's clothing in the walk-in closet, just off of the bed, in the bedroom. Why would someone want to set a fire there? It had made sense back when it appeared to be the girlfriend. Angela Bassett famously did something similar, and now Stella got her groove back when she found out her husband was cheating on her. But why would a stranger want to destroy his clothes? Setting fire to someone's belongings, like their clothing, it's not about the clothes. It's about a desire to diminish someone, to control them, fueled by a deep-seated insecurity, anger, jealousy. And a random intruder, they would have no reason to want to set fire to Michael's clothes. If anything, they'd look through the items to see if there was anything of value and leave the rest behind. There had to be more to this than just a violent home invasion. Unless this wasn't about the clothes, but a desire to destroy something else in this closet. What was it that was here that they were missing? These walk-in closets were quite the selling point, because there wasn't just storage in the closet itself, but there was even more storage if you really needed it. That is, if you knew where to look for it. There was secret surplus storage space, accessible through a small square panel located on the ceiling of that closet. A panel that if you stood on a stepladder you could reach, lifting your arms to easily slide that panel to the side, revealing a large, spacious, shared attic. Detectives didn't know if Michael Andrade even knew about this crawl space. But as their flashlights pierced every dark corner of that secret attic, it became chillingly apparent someone else did. Michael Andrade's murderer. In 2005, there wasn't a word for it yet. The term frogging, with a PHROGGING, that term frogging wouldn't be popularized until 2014. But the term, used to describe people secretly living in someone else's home, that phenomenon has been around much longer than that. And that term frogging, it's short for leapfrogging. But that word is misleading because it suggests that these individuals simply leap from one place to the next, as if people's private lives and most intimate spaces were like glistening lily pads without much disruption or consequence, when the reality is far more sinister. Maybe a better word for it is planting. These individuals are like spores that drop unseen, unnoticed into our lives, taking root behind our walls, growing aggressive, unnoticed, until one day they take over. That word, planting, well, it's also a reference to one of the most notorious cases of this kind, one that featured a family called the Bowens and a very disturbed young man named Daniel LaPlante. It was 1986, an era you might call peak Gen X, the era of latchkey kids, what's now romanticized as free-range parenting. But the fact was, back in the 1980s, if you had two parents working to put food on the table, plenty of kids under the age of 16 lived a good part of their lives unsupervised by adults. But even by these feral standards, the Bowen girls were living in the extreme. Sure, 14-year-old Tina and her 9-year-old sister Karen weren't abused. They had food in the fridge, clothing on their backs. But ever since their mother passed away, roughly a year earlier, the girls, the two sisters, had spent much of their time, too much of their time, in the house alone. Their father knew it wasn't ideal. He worked in the hospitality industry, which meant long hours and frequent business trips, but it was a good job, one he couldn't afford to lose. The girls were alone so much that eventually their father agreed for one of Tina's friends, a 15-year-old girl named Kathleen, to stay with the two girls when he traveled. Safety in numbers. But no amount of eyes or ears could make sense of what was happening in that house in 1986. A series of mysterious noises and unsettling events that led the three girls to believe the old Massachusetts house they lived in was haunted by a ghost. Which sounded silly. And Frank Bowen, their father, told them it was all in their heads. They were told this was all a reaction to their mother's death, unprocessed grief. But Tina and her little sister and their friend, they were all quite convinced the house was haunted, because believing in an invisible presence floating down the halls was better than the alternative, a disturbed teenage boy hiding in the walls. It would take a long time, at least a year, before the family realized a twisted and troubled neighborhood boy named Daniel LaPlante had broken into the Bowen home squeezed himself into every nook and cranny of that house. Spying on the girls through electrical sockets he turned into peepholes. Always there, as if waiting for an opportunity to... Who knew? When he was finally discovered by Frank, the girl's father, this boy didn't even look human. He resembled more like a wild-haired, dead-eyed demon, a Babadook, who emerged from the darkness wielding a hatchet and a wrench. This boy, Daniel LaPlante, he was eventually apprehended and arrested on a few charges, including stalking and kidnapping. And when Tina discovered it was Danny LaPlante behind all of this, Tina was stunned. She knew Danny LaPlante. Sort of. A year or so earlier, when they were both around 13, Danny and Tina had struck up a friendship over the phone. Only when he expressed romantic interest in Tina, and she finally met him in person, she rejected him. She found the boy creepy and wanted nothing to do with him. Rejected, it seemed Danny became fixated on Tina, and that fixation spiraled into stalking and what would be eventually known as frogging. Though this boy didn't just leapfrog from one place to the next, he destroyed people and their lives. Tina's little sister, Karen, would claim he destroyed her entire childhood. After that incident, she, her sister, their friend, as well as their father, felt completely violated and lost all trust, never feeling safe, not really, in their home or any home ever again. And yet, despite their lifelong terror and trauma, the Bowen family would later consider themselves lucky. In 1987, while Daniel LaPlante was out on bail awaiting trial in that case, he broke into another house, this time ambushing another family and killing all 3 individuals who lived there. Daniel LaPlante was charged in those 3 murders and was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. But because these crimes were committed when Daniel LaPlante was a juvenile, his sentence does include the possibility of parole. Daniel LaPlante is now in his 50s, and the first time he will be up for parole, potentially, will be in 2032. By then, Daniel LaPlante will be 62 years old. The case of Daniel LaPlante was one of the most notorious, and eventually the most deadly, incidences of frogging. But Daniel's apparent motive, at least with Tina Bowen, was one of the most common. He'd been rejected by her, and terrorizing Tina in her own home was his way of getting even. Back in San Antonio, Texas, the worst had already happened. Michael Andrade was dead, and whoever did it, detectives now believe they'd made their way into his apartment through this crawl space, maneuvering from this shared attic into this walk-in closet. So they took a closer look in that attic, which was largely empty. No signs of food or clothing or surveillance gear, the kind of stuff you might see in other frogging cases. But there was evidence someone had been up there quite a bit. The floor of the attic was covered with yellow-colored, fluffy insulation. It had the texture of cotton candy. The detectives immediately noticed parts of the insulation were flattened by someone moving around up there. The roof was slanted, so there wasn't much standing room. So it looked like this person was maybe on their feet, but mostly on their hands and knees, maybe even crawling on their stomach, moving back and forth, one place to the next. In this repeated motion, it had flattened this insulation, creating a very clear path from one place to the next. And authorities, carefully crawling on their hands and knees, followed the path as it led them to a place they did not want to go. A place they hadn't expected to be. The apartment that shared the attic space. There was only one. It was the apartment that also shared a wall with Michael Andrade. The apartment of a young woman, a single mother, named Maria. Could it be possible that Maria was the one who was crawling back and forth from her apartment to Michael Andrade's, using the attic as a point of entry and exit? It had to be, because when they questioned Maria, she was clear. She lived alone with her child. There was no one else there. Though detectives did say they got the impression that Maria, well, how did they put it? That she was desperate for love. And that it seemed like she was willing to do anything to be in a relationship with a man. Had she and Michael formed some kind of romantic bond? And if so, was she so desperate that if things didn't go her way, was she willing to kill for love? When they questioned Maria, she swore she knew nothing about this. She had never even been up to that attic. She had no relationship with Michael. But authorities believed she was hiding something. And while they tried to get the truth of what happened and why, they did a full sweep of Maria's apartment, searching the whole place for evidence. And they were looking for some of the missing items, like his laptop. But during the search of her apartment, they found something even more promising, even more damning. A pair of jeans in a laundry hamper. And those jeans looked like they were dusted with what looked like tiny fluffs of pale yellow cotton candy. Could these pieces of fluff on those jeans match the insulation found in the attic? Police couldn't say for sure. But of course, it's forensic files. So they knew a forensic expert who could. Forensic analyst Michael Martinez. His specialty was in trace evidence. Those tiny details that had big impact on a case. And for Michael Andrade's murder investigation, analyst Martinez had to decide if the material found on those jeans that were found in Maria's apartment matched the insulation found in the attic. Part of his work began by using a pair of metal tweezers to delicately pluck tiny samples of the fluff found on those jeans and compare those samples with the insulation in the attic. But as he studied each sample under a powerful microscope, Martinez noticed, strangely, these samples were not the same. The pieces of fluff found on the jeans, they had a very distinct shape that was quite different from the attic insulation. Both samples derived from the same material, fiberglass, but up close, the attic insulation looked more like threads, while the particles found on the jeans, they were more like clustered spheres, like the shape of hundreds of teeny tiny little footballs. Martinez zoomed in even closer with his powerful microscope, wondering what would cause these strange shapes. Then he realized those football shapes, they were caused by intense heat. Wait a second. He did a few tests, and he realized these threads, they actually were the same, but with one distinct difference in the sample found on the jeans. The reason why those little threads look like tiny footballs is because those threads have been burned. And fiberglass, at least these tiny little pieces, when they meet heat, the threads curl up, creating these spherical ball shapes. Those pieces of singed insulation on those jeans essentially placed the killer at the time and place of the crime. In the search of Maria's apartment, they also collected her vacuum, including the vacuum bag, removing the contents of the bag and analyzing everything found inside for possible evidence. And the vacuum bag, it also held pieces of those very same fluffy fibers, a combination, actually, of the kind found inside the attic and the singed pieces found on those jeans. Based on these small pieces of evidence, it appeared they would have enough to arrest neighbor Maria in the murder of Michael Andrade. And potentially, she could keep denying it. But the story seemed to tell itself that this quiet, sort of mousy, unassuming, but romantically desperate woman who lived next door had developed some type of relationship, or imagined some type of relationship, with her neighbor Michael. And that morning, maybe Maria had made herself known in his apartment, and when things didn't go the way she wanted them to, she murdered him and set his apartment ablaze. It all seemed to fit together perfectly. Well, perfectly enough to make a case. Except there was one detail that didn't fit. Those jeans. They didn't fit. The jeans they tested, it turned out they weren't Maria's jeans. Those jeans, they were men's jeans. And there was clear evidence that those jeans had been worn by a man. But who? Maria swore she lived alone. She was a single mother. The detectives pressed Maria, warning her she was in big trouble. She could go down for this murder unless she started telling the truth. Whose jeans were they? Finally, Maria cracked. She wasn't lying. Legally, she did live alone. But, well, she'd recently met someone online. And they'd hit it off. And now he was staying with her for a little while. His name was Joe. Joe Luna. And they were in love. Of course, Joe Luna wasn't capable of love. At least not with people. Only things, money, himself. 25-year-old Joe Luna had a rap sheet that went back at least a decade. Robberies and break-ins. And Joe had only just gotten out of a 5-year prison bid when he met Maria online and shamelessly insinuated himself into her life. Joe was using Maria's apartment as a hideout. He was the main suspect in a series of home invasions in the area. And while staying at his new girlfriend's apartment, it seems, as a restless career criminal, Joe couldn't help but snoop around Maria's house. And when he discovered, in Maria's walk-in closet, that there was a crawl space, and the attic was shared with another tenant, of course he felt compelled to check out the neighbor's place and see what he might find and what he might steal. It only took a stepladder and a few extra minutes to pop the panel off of the crawl space area in Maria's apartment, then maneuver a few feet through that insulation over to Michael's apartment, removing the panel of Michael's crawl space, then lowering himself down into the clothes closet to see what he could grab. He'd robbed plenty of times before. But what caught Joe by surprise this time was his drop into the closet essentially left him stranded, suddenly face to face, just about, with Michael Andrade, who was asleep in his bed, then startled awake when Joe crash-landed into the closet in his bedroom. At first, Joe followed his usual MO when he broke into a house. He tied or taped up whoever was in the house, making sure they couldn't move, terrorizing them as he stole their valuables, leaving them terrified but alive. But that morning, February 17th, something went wrong for Joe. There was evidence that Michael may have successfully broken at least one arm free. And now, panicking perhaps because he wasn't wearing any mask and Michael could get away and identify him, Joe quickly tore a strip of bedsheet from Michael's bed, using it as a ligature, then pulling it for several long minutes until Michael fatally collapsed, face down, on the bed. Joe knew a lot about violence and brutality, but he didn't know much about chemistry. Joe Luna never even finished high school. He dropped out to run the streets of San Antonio before the 8th grade. So Joe didn't know the most basic exothermic principles of fire. That you can't just drop a lit match on the ground and expect an inferno. Fire is a chain reaction of 3 things present at once: fuel, heat, and oxygen. After killing Michael, a frenzied Joe wanted to destroy any evidence that might lead cops back to him. It seems he thought using matches or a lighter to a few surfaces would be enough to cause a blaze. But after he lit those little fires, then scurried back up to the attic to crawl into Maria's apartment, he kept waiting for a strong smell of smoke from those roaring flames, anticipating the sound of an apartment fire alarm. But minutes passed, and nothing. Concerned, Joe went back up to the attic then back down to Michael's apartment, where he realized most of the fires he started had burned enough to generate a lot of smoke and debris, but not real flames. So this time, he went around the house, strategically relighting the fires, like the antique chair that was covered in highly flammable fabric, old wood, and varnish. Then the sheets around Michael's bed. Then back to lighting up Michael's closet, setting it on fire one last time. But before he did that, he did one last sweep for Michael's valuables. His speakers, laptop, and the keys to his truck. He'd figure out the logistics of it all later. For now, he just needed to get out of that apartment, back up into the attic, and back into Maria's place. And it was there, in her apartment, that he realized his shoes and jeans were coated with debris, from the insulation to the bits of soot. So he hauled out Maria's vacuum and haphazardly tried to suck the evidence away. Only he stopped short of doing his own laundry. Instead, he threw those dirty jeans into the family's laundry hamper. Those very same jeans that investigators would find, establishing that he was there in Michael's apartment. Joe Luna was arrested and charged with capital murder. If found guilty, he could get the death penalty. Joe pleaded not guilty, only for Joe to make a strange declaration right in the middle of his trial. Against the advice of his lawyers, Joe Luna, now 26 years old, he announced to the entire court he was changing his plea from not guilty to guilty. But that wasn't all. Joe said he wanted, no, he demanded, that the jury give him the punishment he deserved. He wanted them to give him the death penalty. In court, he read a statement he'd prepared aloud. And it was quite a rousing speech. Prison was no place for a man. It wasn't even a place for an animal. You go in an animal, Joe said. You come out a beast. And after the life he'd lived and everything he'd done, he wasn't afraid of death. In fact, he was tired, so very tired. And he was ready to go. So please, he begged, give him the death penalty so he wouldn't have to die in prison an old man. And while all of this, to the untrained ear, may sound like remorse, what experts often say about this type of request, it's just another expression of control. For men like Joe Luna, control is everything. And that need for control was reflected in his crimes. One psychologist said that certain individuals find a glamour in asking for the death penalty, as if there's a fearlessness or a courage in this demand. You'll go out in a blaze of glory. And so, in 2006, Joe Luna was granted what he'd asked for. He was sentenced to death. Now, that was the perfect ending for an episode of Forensic Files. But the story of Joe Luna, it didn't end there. Because Joe Luna didn't seem to realize being placed on death row and being executed were two very different things that happened on two very different timelines. There are individuals who spend decades on death row, and they die of old age, even if they want to be executed. And the reasons for this are complicated and too much to get into at this time of night. But one day we'll explore it through one of the most famous cases of all time, Gary Gilmore. In Norman Mailer's award-winning classic, The Executioner Song. As for Joe Luna, it's been 20 years. He's now in his 40s, and he's still on death row. Only now, ironically, he spent the last decade or so fighting for his own survival, realizing he wanted to live, and angling for a resentencing. Though, as of now, the state of Texas has told him there's no backsies. Until further notice, Joe Luna, the man who extinguished the life of an innocent victim, a killer who wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, now lives in a hell of his own making. A ghost, hidden behind those walls. A phantom, forever invisible to the rest of the world. Thank you for listening to the second installment of Forensic Files February. I will be back February 28th with the third and final installment, a bonus episode. Be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Until then, nighty-night.